Hey, did you figure out the reward amounts that equal exactly $100? I sure hope so, otherwise you shouldn't be here yet. All right, their values were the $21, $35, and $44. So I'm going to continue reading on page 120. Jake was still staring at the posters from behind them when from behind them came a series of loud popping sounds. The two boys wrenched around trying to find the source. The panicky, overdramatic part of Winston's brain insisted they were gunshots, but the rational side, less than a second later, placed the sound as firecrackers, which is what they were. The firecrackers had been lit among the crowd of people waiting to get on the Ferris wheel, and the result was the same as gunfire. Several moments of yelling and chaos as the mob scattered like a flock of panicking birds. Winston spotted Mr. Garvey pressed up against the fence to avoid getting trampled. The guy running the Sunwheel had been helping people into one of the empty cars, and now he came running back to see what was happening. Winston and Jake forgot the crowd and made their way to their teacher. The staccato pops and bangs ended as suddenly as they had begun, the final explosions lingering in the summer air, along with several blossoms of gray smoke. Winston looked around. Who had set off those firecrackers? He couldn't tell. He expected to see a couple of teenage boys standing off to the side laughing at the panic they had just caused. But there was nobody. People started coming back to the ride. Mr. Garvey dismissed the event. All right. Is Mal back yet? I'd like to get out of here already. He craned his neck around, trying to figure out which car Mal was on while the ride was temporarily stopped. At that moment, the guy running the ride said loudly, "Hey, where's my key?" He was standing at the ride's mechanism looking around, a bewildered expression on his face. He was in his early 20s, or maybe not even that old, and he had a scruff of beard and a pierced lip. "Hey!" He turned to the people coming back to the ride. "Did you take my key? That's not cool, man. I need that." Wilson and Jake and Mr. Garvey watched the fellow pat his pockets and scan the ground for the missing key. Mr. Garvey's face reflected terrible understanding. He elbowed his way in and said, "What key? What did you lose?" "The key to the ride. What do you think? The key to the Ferris wheel, man." Winston looked up at the ride and finally saw Mal. He was still in his car, 50 feet in the air. The cheater. The cheater had set off the firecrackers, distracted everybody, snatched the key to the ride. A whole bunch of teams had people on that ride, and the cheater bamboozled all of them in one go. Mal, trapped on the Sunwheel, was yelling something and pointing urgently. Winston tried to focus on what he was saying. It sounded like, "There, there." Winston and Jake whirled around and they saw him, just for a fraction of a second. A man in a green jacket, a backpack over his shoulder, elbowing his way through the crowd, trying to get away. Jake took off after him. Mr. Garvey yelled, "No, Jake, get back here!" Jake wasn't listening. He ran at full speed. He might as well have been shot out of a cannon. Jake was one of the school's best athletes, a fact Winston sometimes forgot, simply because Jake never bragged about it. Well, he was certainly reminding them now. He dodged through the crowd like an afternoon breeze, slipping sideways through tight spots, weaving around baby strollers until Winston couldn't see him anymore. Mr. Garvey grabbed Winston by the shoulders and shouted into his face, "Stay here. Do not move." He took off after Jake, although at a much slower rate. Mr. Garvey didn't look like a guy who was used to running. The people on the ride were beginning to realize that they had a problem. Some were shouting, "Get me down!" and, "Hey, why aren't we moving?" The guy operating the ride didn't seem to know what to do other than pace back and forth uselessly. "Is there another key?" Winston shouted to him. "I don't know where the key is," the guy shouted back, irritated. Winston tried again. "Where's another key?" But the guy didn't answer. just kept looking at the ground as if the key might burrow out of its hiding place like a woodchuck. Winston glanced up at Mal, who was clutching the bars of his skybound jail cell like a prisoner in a science fiction movie. Beside him, Elvie was doing the same thing. At this rate, they were going to be stuck up there for a long time, unless somebody jumped in to solve this nasty little problem. Knowing Mr. Garvey might actually kill him, Winston ran. Someone had to have another key. Lip-Ring didn't look like he was going to figure out what to do anytime soon. He ran past Bethany and Giselle. "Where are you going?" Bethany yelled at him. Not stopping, Winston yelled back, "The business office. They'll have another key." To Winston's surprise, Bethany burst into a run and quickly joined him. Winston heard her teacher yelling, but Bethany ignored her. She seemed to think that commands from adults, even shouted, urgent commands, were strictly optional. She was going to get into serious trouble later. Then Winston remembered that he was disobeying direct orders as well. There was going to be more than enough trouble to go around. He headed for the heart of Adventureland. Bethany was right behind him. The paths in the park ambled this way and that. You could hardly walk in a straight line for more than 20 feet. Winston and Bethany rounded a corner and almost crashed into a crowd of teenagers. They skirted around them gingerly, avoiding their glares and their shouts of, "Hey, kid." "Cut through the arcade," Bethany yelled to him and veered diagonally over to a long, low-roofed building. Winston, panting, his heart thudding in his chest, strained to catch up. They bounded up the stoop and into the building, running past the skee-ball bowlers and little kids playing whack-a-mole. They burst out the other side and found themselves at the entrance to the office. The business office was a small white house that looked like it had been blown here from a nearby neighborhood. When he was a little kid, Winston thought that some lucky family lived in that house, right in the middle of an amusement park. They ran up 3 steps of the porch and through the door. Behind a counter, an overweight woman sat pecking at a typewriter, and a casually dressed man was chatting on the phone, leaning way back in his swivel chair. This was not the time for politeness. "I need the key to the Ferris wheel," Winston shouted, leaning all of his weight on the counter so as not to collapse on the floor. Beside him, Bethany was also trying to catch her breath. The woman turned to him, startled. She wore a little name tag on her wildly colored blouse that identified her as Rhonda Weeks. The man on the phone ignored them. He turned away and put a finger in the ear that wasn't glued to the phone. Winston only needed one person's attention. "The Ferris wheel is stuck," he told Rhonda Weeks. "The guy lost the key, and there are people stuck on the ride. You have an extra key, right? We need it." Rhonda squinted at him. "What do you mean he lost the key?" Waving her hands for emphasis, Bethany said, "Someone stole the keys, and people are stuck up on the ride." "Ride operators are supposed to keep the key on them at all times," Rhonda said crossly. Winston thought she was focusing on the wrong part of the problem. "Well, he lost it. Do you have an extra?" She considered them for several long moments and then said, "Yeah, hang on." She opened up a desk drawer and began rooting through it. Winston put a closed fist to his mouth to prevent himself from yelling at her to hurry up. He had hoped he could retrieve the key and get back to the Ferris wheel before Mr. Garvey even knew he had left. Winston felt the seconds race by while she sorted through a decade's worth of broken pencils and loose change. "All right, here we go," she said at last. Then, to Winston's horror, she hoisted herself up from her chair. "Let's go." Winston's plan was to run back to the Sunwheel as quickly as they had run here. He did not get the impression that Rhonda Weeks was planning to run with them. For one thing, she was oblivious to the urgency of the situation. And it was also clear Rhonda Weeks had not done any running in a long, long time. Okay. He and Bethany shared a look of dismay. Rhonda plodded to the office door, the key dangling casually in her hand. A plan materialized in Winston's brain. He knew it was a bad idea, maybe even a very bad idea, but he didn't see that he had a choice. Not if he wanted to get back to the Ferris wheel during this century. There was still a chance he could get back without getting into trouble with Mr. Garvey. Rhonda took her first slow step down the office's small porch. Winston touched Bethany on the shoulder and whispered, "Get ready to run." He gestured purposefully at the key. She looked at him, at first not understanding, and then getting it all at once. Not allowing himself to think, Winston jumped off the porch. He snatched the key out of Rhonda Weeks' fist and ran. "Hey!" she yelled, but Winston and Bethany were already 20 feet away. "Get back here!" she screamed. Other people glanced their way, but nobody made a move to stop them. His fevered brain tried to see into the future. Maybe this would all work out. He'd get back to the Ferris wheel, and if by some miracle Mr. Garvey was still chasing Jake and the man with the green jacket, then Winston would give the key to Mr. Lipring. He'd get Mel off the ride, out of the park, before Rhonda Weeks caught up. If everything went just right, there was a microscopically thin chance he might get away with this. That thin chance vanished in the very next moment. Winston glanced behind him as he rounded the first corner and saw something he hadn't considered when he came up with this idea. The guy who'd been on the telephone was no longer on the telephone. He had burst out of the office and was running straight at them, and he looked really fast. "Oh no," he said. Bethany looked over her shoulder and saw the problem. How could they possibly keep ahead of this guy? "Come on," Bethany said, and ducked into the arcade again. Winston followed, trying not to panic. They had a head start, but it wasn't going to last long. They had maybe 10 seconds to figure something out. Winston saw a photo booth with a curtain, a hiding spot. He started to jump in, but Bethany grabbed him. "No, come with me." She ran down an aisle of arcade games, practically dragging Winston. She stopped abruptly and shoved Winston into the gap between the two machines. There was barely enough room for him, but then, astonishingly, Bethany squeezed herself into the same gap, forcing Winston even further backward as he was as squashed as Santa coming down a chimney. "Keep going," she hissed. "There's nowhere to go," he whispered back. "Yes, there is. Look." Winston looked and saw that Bethany was right. The gap they had squeezed into was narrow but long, and where Winston thought it ended, it was bent into a little L-shaped corner. Winston rounded this corner, and Bethany followed. They ended up in an even smaller space, packed as tightly as peanut butter inside a jar, but they were undoubtedly out of sight. "That security guard would have looked into the photo machine first thing," said Bethany. They were standing nose to nose, or more accurately, nose to chin. Bethany was about 3 inches taller than Winston. He was all too aware how this would look to anybody who just would discover them now. He hoped they were not discovered. "How do you know about this place?" he whispered. "My brother and I played hide and seek in here last year, and he never found me." "How long should we stay?" Winston said. Bethany shrugged and shook her head. Winston tried to listen beyond this fortress of video games, but he couldn't hear anything. The guy could be right outside their little cramped space. There'd be no way to know. But they couldn't stay here forever. Indeed, they couldn't stay here very long at all. "We'll count to 10, and then we'll run," he whispered. Bethany nodded in agreement. Even a slight nod caused their heads to bonk together. Winston forced himself to count slowly. He could feel his blood pumping in his veins. They needed to get back to that Ferris wheel. He was also a cauldron of emotions: delight, discomfort, amazement at being so physically close to this girl who he had to admit that he liked very much. He reached 10, and they eased out of their hiding place. Bethany looked both ways down the aisle of arcade games. Shaky with relief, she said, "It's okay, let's go." They started running again. Winston still expected that guy to land on him at any second, but he was gone. They ran down the pathway toward the final corner, euphoric at making it back to the Ferris wheel without getting caught. He felt like a spy who had successfully completed a dangerous mission. But the giddy feeling didn't last long. As they rounded the corner, Winston realized just how big of a fool he was. When the security guard lost track of him, he didn't give up and go back to his office or vanish like an extra in a movie. He knew where Winston was going, and he went there first. The security guard was right there waiting for them. Worse yet, he seemed to have rounded up everybody involved with the puzzle contest. He was talking with Mr. Garvey, but all the other teams were gathered around listening in. There was Rod Denham with his team. There were Bethany's teammates. Even the Ferris wheel operator was there, Mr. Lippering himself. Winston groaned. The next few minutes were going to be very, very bad. Mr. Garvey looked stone-faced, so angry that he didn't even know how to express it. The Ferris wheel was not moving, which in some way was fine with Winston. He wouldn't have wanted to go through all of this for nothing. Everybody looked up as Winston and Bethany came into view. The man from the park pointed at them as they approached. He looked like a professional wrestler, right down to the furious expression on his face. "Give me that key," he said. Winston, with his head down, handed the security guy the key, which he instantly turned over to Lippering. "You're supposed to keep this on you at all times," the security guy said to the kid. "If this ever happens again, you'll have to find another summer job." Lippering nodded his head, afraid to speak. "Now, get all those people off this ride." Lippering wordlessly went to follow orders. The security guy turned back to Winston. "And you get out of my park." That's the end of chapter 8.